so I said I was going to spend the summer. Then 6 weeks later, I called my parents and I said, I'm not going back. I'm staying in San Francisco. I'm going to transfer. I'm going to find a school that will take me. And this is where I want to live my life.
That was Rachele Kanigal, chair of the journalism department at SF State and author of the Diversity Style Guide. I'm Jeff, and this is Storied San Francisco. In this episode, Rachele shares the story of her life with us. She grew up in suburban New Jersey, just outside of New York City. She didn't relate to her surroundings and, as a teenager, found herself going into the big city every chance she got. After brief stints at 2 colleges, she came to San Francisco for a few weeks to visit her brother. But she was so in love with it here that she never left. Check back Thursday for part 2. Here's Rachele.
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, and I grew up, so I lived there for 6.5 years and then moved to a town in New Jersey called Fairlawn, which was a suburb of New York City. Mm-hmm. And I grew up with Eastern European Jewish background. Mm-hmm. My father ran a small business, a metal refinishing business, and my mother was a teacher at times and she worked for my father's business a little bit. And
what did she teach?
It's funny because she didn't teach a whole lot. She was mostly substitute teaching, mm-hmm. but she loved English literature, mm-hmm. and she was and it's funny even that I mentioned her as a teacher because I don't know why but I think that that's how she saw herself, even though she didn't teach a whole lot. She had 3 kids, very spaced out. So my brother's 15 years older. My younger older brother is 8 years older, and then me. Okay. So she was raising kids for a long time.
Yeah, roughly every 8 years.
Yeah.
And then...
Exactly. And so, and then she did bookkeeping for my father's business. Mm-hmm. But she raised us in this environment where she was always like reading poetry to us and exposing us to Shakespeare and I think that was a big part of her identity. And then she actually did a little bit of writing too. She wrote. My brother was an editor on a publication in Baltimore, and she wrote some sort of memoir type stories about her background,
her
and
own
stuff
life.
like that. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, do you know where that came from for her? Where this sort of love of literature and
I think from poetry? Her mother. Her mother wasn't college educated, but she was a big reader.
Okay.
And but yeah, my mother was just like crazy about words, like everything having to do with words. She loved Scrabble. She loved as I say, poetry, literature, Jane Austen, Dickens.
I mean, it sounds like I would be friends with her, to be honest. Yeah, she sounds like someone I would really get along with.
Yeah. She was a pretty cool woman and quite a character.
Yeah, and so she passed that along to you and both of your brothers?
Well, I would say both of my brothers have done some writing. One of my brothers has been a professional writer for most of his life and has written a lot of books. He writes biography. I can't really say what he writes because every book is different, but he has written a number of biographies of Jane Jacobs and Frederick Winslow Taylor and
published stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Robert Kanigal is his name.
Does he consider himself a writer first and foremost?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's what he does for a living. That's what he's done most of his career.
What was it like to grow up with 2 older brothers, one of whom you said was 15 and one was 8 years older?
Yeah.
I mean, was it? Well, I guess just what was that like?
Yeah. So, well,
I guess maybe tied to that question, explain to folks what this. You said Fairlawn, New Jersey. What that was like?
Yeah. So, so my brothers really grew up in Brooklyn, and I grew up in New Jersey.
Oh, right.
And my older brother Robert went to college when he was 16. So
Okay.
I was just a baby when he left the house, and he basically never came back. So, so he and I didn't really have a relationship till I was in my 20s.
Okay.
I mean, I would see him, but he felt more like a cousin, you know, because we didn't really grow up in the same house.
Yeah, that age difference is definitely significant.
Yeah.
Until a certain, like when you said when you're.
And now
20s,
we're close.
right?
Now, because we actually have a lot in common, and you know, I became a writer, and he was a writer, and you know, we have a lot of interests in common and things like that. But yeah, it wasn't a typical brother-sister relationship. And then my brother Harry left when I was about. He was sort of in and out of the house from the time I was about, 9 or 10, and so.
Because that would have been the end of his
roughly
high school
he
years.
went to boarding school for a year or two, and then he went away to college, and then he moved to San Francisco, which is how I ended up here.
Oh, okay.
So
we'll get to that.
Okay, we'll get to that
for sure.
And as I say, I grew up in this town that I never really related to. It was this suburban town, and
working class, would you say?
No, it was more of a middle class town, very white, very very Jewish. It was about half Jewish, about 40 or 50% Jewish, and I thought it was the most boring place in the entire world.
You even, as a child,
as a child,
young person, you knew that. Okay.
I just thought it was really. I felt very confined there. I felt very. Like there was just sort of one way to be. I was very aware of how an undiverse place it was, growing up there.
I was going to ask, what was your exposure to not that? Would it be TV, magazines, radio, like media,
Well, I lived near New York City.
Or just New York City being right there. That'll do it.
And so from the time I was about, 12, 13, 14, I would go into the city with my friends. And then I had a boyfriend who lived in New York City when I was about 16, 17. So I would spend a lot of time in New York. And it was such a contrast to the town that I grew up in.
For sure.
Yeah, and I just felt like I would cross that bridge, the George Washington Bridge, and I would feel alive, and I would feel like, it was so vibrant and such an exciting place. And the town that I grew up in, like I say, it just felt very boring and confining.
It was a version. I'm just like kind of drawing a picture in my head. You're crossing that bridge, and it's a version of these are my people. But it's also this is my place.
Right. Although, for me, I really had that kind of feeling when I came to San Francisco. So I can tell you
which we'll talk about.
Yeah. Okay. We'll hold off on that.
Can you give us a rough, like a decade that you're talking about when you said you're like 13, 14, and first starting to come to the city?
70s. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the 70s.
This is the 70s.
And obviously New York was everywhere. It was different. But there's kind of like a, I don't know, like a kernel or like an essence of New York that really hasn't changed. It was like that.
Yeah.
What kind of things would you do when you came to the city?
My favorite thing to do, even then, was just walking the streets of New York City.
Like people watching?
Yeah, people watching. I mean, I went to museums, I went to Broadway shows, I went to, off-Broadway, more avant-garde kind of shows. I went to some jazz clubs when I was a little older, But really the thing that I loved, and to this day love, is just walking the streets of New York City.
It's one of the best places I know to do that.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we hear a little bit about, and I'm sorry to drag you back to that place that you didn't like, but, maybe in addition to you mentioned that your mom would read you poetry and expose you to that sort of, but what was home life like for you?
I was just dying to get out.
The whole time? You had one
the whole time. And I actually left a year early.
Okay.
I left high school after my junior year. I found a college that had an early admissions program, and so that's what I
love
wanted
that
to
though,
do.
because there's the whole scripted path. It works for some people, for sure, but it doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't have to work for everyone.
Yeah.
So
I was pretty. I mean, I got good grades. I was a straight A student, but I didn't work very hard. I wasn't engaged. I wasn't.
You didn't feel challenged.
I didn't feel challenged. I didn't feel. I just wanted to get the hell out of there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, was it ever? Was it scary to get out, to leave early? Or was it just something that was so set in your head?
It was so set in my head. It was a little bit scary. I remember my mother planned this quote surprise party, although she told me about it, with my friends, and I remember thinking, what am I doing? Like, should I be, just leaving high school and so I had that moment of panic, but yeah, for the most part, it felt right. It just felt like I needed to.
It would be unusual
leave.
if you didn't,
Yeah.
I feel like, right?
Yeah.
And maybe just to check yourself and to kind of reaffirm why you're doing this, and right.
Yeah.
And so where did you go?
So I went to Stony Brook for a year. I think it was then called SUNY Stony Brook, so State University of New York at Stony Brook. And then I think it's now called Stony Brook University. So I went there for a year, and as I say, the main criteria was that they would take me after my junior year of high school, which I don't think too many places would have done. So I went there for a year.
And you're maybe 17 or so?
And I'm 17,
Okay.
yeah. And then I went to McGill. I transferred to McGill University in Montreal,
Okay.
which I really liked. I was at Stony Brook for a year. I was at McGill for a year. And then
Did you already speak French?
I didn't.
Okay.
And in fact, it was a tough time I took French classes and I tried to speak French, but it was a time and place where anytime a non-French speaker would try to speak French there, people would speak English
back to
automatically
you,
because
yeah.
they just kind of figured you were a clueless Canadian who hadn't bothered to learn French.
You're like,
So
no, I'm a clueless
it was
American.
sort of political. It was at a time when
Yeah.
Quebec was talking about seceding from Canada, and
I feel like they always are.
yeah. So
But also, I've never been to Montreal. I've kind of been fascinated by it. How was it? How did you?
Montreal was fabulous. It was beautiful. It was cosmopolitan. I loved the French, the Québécois. I loved being in a big city. McGill was right in the middle of downtown Montreal, and
Is it one
it
of
was
those
urban
cities
and-
that feel European?
Yes,
that thing,
yeah, it does.
That
Yeah,
thing, which
it
just means they
definitely
have like a good subway and.
and they have cafes.
They have cafes,
and even though it's
exactly.
really cold, like, in April it was freezing, but the cafe tables would come out on the street, and I loved
Sidewalk
Montreal and I loved
culture.
McGill, and it was great.
Did you go in knowing what you were going to study already, or did you figure that out?
No, in fact, I think at one point, I applied as a psychology major, but I never took a psych course.
Okay.
At one point, I was an English major. I was thinking about film. Well, and then I'll tell you how I came to journalism. But yeah.
Okay, is that not right?
No,
Then-
that's the next step.
So what did you end up graduating, or
No.
Okay.
So then I, my brother, my older brother, had been semi-estranged from my family for several years. He lived in San Francisco. We kind of knew he was there. Every now and then we'd get a postcard or something
Do you know
from
what
him.
brought him out here?
I'm not sure, but I think he was looking to get as far away from Fairlawn.
That'll do it. Yeah. Yes.
And so anyway, he reestablished contact with my parents. They went to see him. And so I said, I'm going to California. I'm going to visit my brother. I haven't seen him in years.
And what year was that?
That was 1980. So May 6, 1980, I got on a World Airways flight to San Francisco. Actually, it was to Oakland. And then I had to take BART, and he met me at the BART station. And the plan was that I would visit for 2 weeks. And
just you by yourself?
Yes.
Okay.
Just me by myself. So at this point, I'm 19. And I, that was the plan. I would visit him for 2 weeks. And my first day in San Francisco, I said, I'm spending the summer here.
Okay.
And then 6 weeks later.
What I really mean is 12 weeks.
Yeah. and I 6 weeks later, I call my parents, so I said I was going to spend the summer. Then 6 weeks later, I called my parents and I said, I'm not going back.
Okay.
I'm staying in San Francisco. I'm going to transfer. I'm going to find a school that will take me. And this is where I want to live my life.
We're going to have to unpack that, Rachele, because that's what our podcast is all about. I mean, there, for folks who are born and raised and are still there, even if they went away, it's like, well, why didn't you go somewhere else? And then for transplants like you and like myself, it's what drew us there in the first place that I'm really fascinated with. So what the hell happened that summer?
So that summer, first of all, I just fell instantly in love with San Francisco, with the city, with everybody I met. I felt like I was home. I felt like it had people I could connect with. A few weeks after I got there, I was staying with a friend. My brother lived in a very tiny little place, so he.
And where was that?
That was in. I'm trying to remember where he lived, because he lived in a couple of places.
I guess neighborhoods are fine if you don't remember.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if it was like the Tenderloin or just north of the Tenderloin, like Tender Knob.
What some people call Tender Knob.
Yeah, Tender Knob. Yeah. He was living around there in a tiny, tiny little place.
Around like Polk in California.
That sort of area, but I can't remember where it was. He later moved to a different place. So he was living there. A friend of his was living in an old bakery in the Mission.
I love it.
And had some other women staying there, and just it was just sort of like a warren of little rooms. And so there was like a mattress on the floor, and he let me stay there for free.
Okay.
For what was supposed to be 2 weeks. And then he took me to a contra dance. This friend of my brother's took me to a contra dance. And then at the contra dance, I met this guy, and we started dating. And Mike.
Sorry, what's I'm not familiar with what contra dance. Yeah.
Contra dance is it's sort of like a folk dance emanating from the British Isles. I can't remember whether it was Scotland or England, but it's a dance. It's similar to sort of like a square dance, but it's done in a line.
Okay.
And
so like a group.
A group,
dance.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so he had taken me to this contra dance, met this guy, started dating him, and he took me to the Gorilla Grotto.
Oh, okay. And
the Gorilla Grotto was this bookstore, coffee house, salon. It was totally San Francisco, founded in the 70s. I got there in 1980, but it was very much a 70s San Francisco kind of place. Very alternative. Lots of interesting people. Just every night they would have some kind of program, and it could be someone talking about being a spy, or someone talking about polyamory, or someone talking about bondage and relationships in a bondage kind of situation. I mean, it was just wild. It was just
Political too.
Political stuff. And it was run by this guy named Gary Warren, who was this unbelievable character. Came out of West Virginia, came to San Francisco, was interested in everything. And so he decided that he would open up this bookstore cafe, bring in people, have these programs, get people talking. He loved provoking people, so he would, he would bring in sort of provocative characters. He was also involved in starting a group called the Suicide Club, which became the Cacophony Society.
Right.
Which
we've had John Law on the
oh
on
really?
The
Oh yeah,
podcast.
John Law was one of the people I hung out with.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There's another connection.
Yeah. So yeah, John Law was quite a character. So anyway, I found the Gorilla Grotto probably 3 or 4 weeks after I got here, and that was definitely part of the I'm never going back here.
And that was through this guy that you had started dating, that you found Gorilla Grotto. Okay.
Found the Gorilla Grotto. Right?
Okay.
And then I ended up moving into a house with Gary, this Gorilla Grotto founder, and my boyfriend at the time, Bruce, and another woman. And so our house sort of became, when the Gorilla Grotto closed, our house sort of became this salon for people to gather.
Almost like an annex or a continuation of that, of whatever was actually happening.
Exactly.
What did your brother think? Is he like, oh, okay, cool? Or like... Or were you seeing him?
Yeah, I saw him from time to time. I think he didn't really like the crowd I was running around with, but yeah, he was fine. He ended up moving not too long after I got there.
Out of San Francisco.
Moving out of San Francisco.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's like he served his purpose of getting you here. And then he's like, peace. That's hilarious.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a really fun time. I did figure out that I did feel like I needed to go back to college. Okay. So I applied to San Francisco State. I think I must have come in on this thing that we have called Open University, where you can just take classes until you get accepted.
Okay.
So I started that fall at San Francisco State of 1980.
Okay.
And I was, casting about, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I took a journalism class. And
kind of on a whim, or?
Kind of on a whim.
Okay.
My brother was, at that point, he was a writer, and I thought, do I want to do something with that? I took this journalism class, and it was the same kind of epiphany, like, this is it. I'm in love. This is what I'm born to do.
Okay.
And it was funny because it was taught by this old guy who was about to retire, and we had manual typewriters. We had a little manual typewriter at each desk, and it was very old school. At that time, the department was all white men. There was one lecturer who was a woman.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
There's a lot of we'll get to that.
But anyway,
I'm just thinking, you said a lot of the typewriters, it's, at the time and today and throughout, the journalism school was mimicking a newsroom. That's, that was the world that inhabited. What was it about that class, or, what drew you in?
I don't really know. I think it was a combination of, I loved talking to people and asking questions. That was a big part of it, because
I don't know what you're talking about. That's foreign to me.
I just loved, I was a very curious person, and I loved asking questions, but I was also somewhat shy. And so if I had a reason to ask people questions, then I don't know, it was like someone had given me a license to be nosy.
The ticket to do that.
And then I also wanted to, to tell stories about what was really going on in the world, and, to talk to people who didn't get spoken to very much, to go into people's lives and share what they were going through, the problems that they had, it was just so fulfilling to me to be able to kind of be a vehicle or someone who could share the stories that
Conduit.
Conduit. Yeah, thank you. That weren't getting told. I just loved
So you
that.
already had that at the time that you were going to school.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I
Not
think,
just writing on, X celebrity or
yeah,
not
no,
to
I wasn't
disparage any
interested
type
in
of
that.
journalism, but
Yeah.
it's very different than
Yeah, but I was very interested in
serving the
real
underserved.
human stories and serving the underserved and giving people voice. I was very much, I had this sense that, I could talk to people, write something up, share their story, and then, give voice to that story that might not get told.
So did you actually graduate with a journalism degree
I did,
from
yeah.
state? Okay, so that class got you in, and you're
Yep,
like,
so
this
that
is what
class
I'm going to
got
do
me
with
in.
my college time.
Right, and so I ended up journalism major. I worked on the student newspaper, which at that time was called the Phoenix.
It wasn't the Express.
No, we actually had two competing newspapers.
Oh,
so we
healthy
had,
competition.
Yes, it was great. And so we had the
Towns
Phoenix.
had two newspapers, a lot of them.
Yes,
We did.
Yeah, San Francisco did. And so it was very much, I think they came out, Golden Gator came out on Tuesday, and the Phoenix came out on Thursday. I think that was right. Maybe
Okay.
it's the other way. But anyway, and we were head-to-head competitors, and
Okay.
it was very lively competition. And
Do those archives exist anywhere?
Yep.
That's cool. God, I'd love to like
come
explore.
visit.
Yeah.
Definitely. You could definitely come by and
That's so cool.
Yeah, we have these stacks and stacks, stacks of shelves of bound newspapers and bound magazines.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's have you graduated.
Mm-hmm.
Now what?
So the year before I graduated, so I ended up taking 3 more years to finish college.
Okay.
But in April of my second year there, I saw a job for a copy editor at this little newspaper called the San Francisco Progress.
And when you say saw, you mean in the newspaper, maybe?
It's funny. I don't know where I
Chronicle
heard about
Examiner or
it,
something.
actually. Yeah.
Maybe a job board?
Maybe a job board. I don't know.
Yeah.
And it was this kind of like a shopper, it was like, it was a community newspaper. It came out 3 times a week and covered the city of San Francisco, and everybody got it. It was just tossed on your doorstep. And people would have signs on their front porches or like in front of their houses saying, please do not deliver the Progress.
Right.
And at one point they wanted to give me some extra hours, so I worked 1 day a week in circulation. And it was all about, could you stop delivering this newspaper? That's how well loved the San Francisco Progress was. But truthfully, there were some people who read it, I'm sure.
Right.
There must have been.
Yeah.
And
You got the job copy editing
And
then,
so I got
or?
a job copy editing. I thought, oh, this is a crappy little newspaper. I guess I'll just see it as a summer job, and then I'll go back to school. But while I was there, they said, well, do you want to, do some reporting? So I started covering stories. And even though it was this crappy little newspaper that nobody read, I was able to go to press conferences with Mayor Dianne Feinstein. And I was covering what we used to call the homeless. And, and so I did a lot of stories about people living on the streets.
For this little shopping.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so yeah, I mean, like I say, it was a lot of ads, but it actually did have, content too. And so that was a time, so now we're talking 1983, 82 to 84, 1982, 83, 84. And so that's when homelessness was really starting to be identified as a problem in San Francisco. It was very different from what it is now. But it was very interesting. And so I spent a lot of time talking to people who were living on the streets, living in the parks. I also, what else was I doing? I'm trying to remember other stories. I can't really remember in great detail, but I spent a lot of time doing that. And so I ended up staying there, and it was kind of cool because most of my friends from journalism school were getting these jobs either out in the suburbs for daily newspapers or out in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
And I was in San Francisco writing about homelessness and
You
writing
got to
about
stay.
Yeah, I got
so
to
you
stay.
were very happy about it.
So I was actually happy, but I did get antsy after a while. I wanted to work for a bigger newspaper, a better newspaper. So I did end up getting a job in the Tri-Valley area. So that's Pleasanton, Livermore, San Ramon, Dublin, that area. So
did you move out there, or did you stay living
I
in San
moved to
Francisco?
Oakland.
Okay.
So then I moved to Oakland, and that was hard because it was like moving from San Francisco to Oakland at the time broke my heart.
That was Rachele Kanigal. On the next episode of Storied San Francisco, hear the conclusion of Rachele's story, including how she went about putting together the Diversity Style Guide. Part 2 drops Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts. Music for the podcast was produced, performed, and curated by Otis McDonald. Original photography is by Michelle Kilfeather. Aaron Lim of Bitch Talk Podcast is our contributing producer. And the show is produced and hosted by me, Jeff Hunt. Now in our 4th season, we have more than 180 episodes available on our website, storiedsf.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you can, please rate and review the show so we can reach even more folks. We love email, and we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at storiedsf@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time on Storied San Francisco.
This podcast is a proud member of the BFF.FM podcast network. Learn more at podcasts.bff.fm.
BFF.FM, best frequencies forever.